Buckle up! It's another episode of The Wrong Idea. In case you're unfamiliar, being wrong is about embracing subjective experience over objective truth. We're not interested in being correct, we just want to explore our own insights and opinions. I'm Jack, as always, joined by my brother Lucas. Tell the people what we're going into this week.
Well, I was thinking a lot this week about one of the most important techniques that I've used over the years to help me gain the tools of my trade, which is, and the technique I'm talking about here is learning how to learn, which is something that I think is missing from the traditional education system.
I would have to agree with you. You and me have talked about this many a times, but in school, they very much so just are teaching things to you. You are just learning. The ability of learning how to learn and doing research and attempting to retain knowledge is something that you don't really get a lot of practice with. It's sort of very guided and fixed, and there's not a whole lot of creativity to explore a lot of the new sort of modern ways that we have for learning.
Well, I wouldn't even say that they have to be modern ways. A lot of what I've learned came from very ancient techniques that were used thousands of years ago. So there's certainly aspects of the modern world that make this more and more important, but I think that as we've gotten to the point where the kind of standardized educational system that is like public education in particular, I mean, even though private education follows essentially a similar model, they just happen to have more resources and are able to do some stuff more effectively. But the point is that this sort of system that exists is kind of based on this old idea that there's a very clear set of skills that you need to acquire and that are hard to learn about unless you are given that information directly. And then once you have them, you can be effective in the world. Like that sort of was the prevailing idea for the last couple hundred years. And as we've had sort of the modern school system, it hasn't really developed beyond that idea, despite the fact that the world now has technology that changes so rapidly that perhaps the job that you might even be thinking about wanting to have once you're out of school might not even exist by the time you're out of school.
Right, it feels so ineffective for the world that surrounds us. It's I mean literally sort of like you said, it's sort of operating on a upon an assumption that doesn't really like have any sort of like importance or relevance in today's world. Because I mean literally like you said, the world is changing so quickly, and there are so many tools which you have at your disposal to help you learn things that I mean frankly, I mean you see adverts that say learn how to code in 30 days. Of course it's exaggerated, but like realistically you could get a pretty good grasp on almost any language that's out there with basically no experience in 30 days. And it's kind of incredible because a long time ago that wouldn't have been possible. It's not even fathomable.
Yeah, well, there's a lot to that. I'm not, I find those kinds of advertisements to be extremely misleading. And like, sure, you can learn a very small subset of skills that allow you to do some jobs, but you're not going to be able to really expand beyond the basics there, and you're not really going to have learned much of those the necessary fundamentals to be able to apply those skills beyond the limited area of expertise that they're trying to teach you, which is usually some particular, in the case of what you're talking about, like coding things, like some particular web framework or whatever. But to your point, like what is happening is that there is a constant need for workers that are skilled in the most recent developing technologies, which are changing so rapidly that there's no way you can be expected to learn them in a fixed curriculum at school that is can't adjust that quickly.
Yeah, it's sort of this need to have a like a like what's a good way to put it? You just need to be able to teach yourself stuff. Like you can't always like lean on somebody else, a teacher at school or I mean literally anyone for any reason to teach you any information. You need to be able to find methods effective for you and yourself to do research, to synthesize it, to draw connections, to expand upon concepts, and literally just teach yourself and without needing a someone to like I don't know, like spoon feed you all the information or whatever. It's a completely different, like, set of skills to have, because it's one thing to, to be able to just take in information, but to be able to, like, find effective information, weed out what's good and bad, is entirely different.
There's definitely an aspect of this that is how you as the learner engage with the material. And this is sort of where I'm coming from, because I didn't find learning the traditional way to be very effective until I started engaging with it differently and teaching myself the things that were interesting to me. And in doing that, I had to come up with techniques that were helpful to actually retain the knowledge that I felt mattered. And that was something that I didn't get a lot in school, where I would just sort of be given an information dump and expected to retain it for as long as was needed to be tested on it. And then there was really no incentive to keep it beyond that.
I think it sort of is an unhealthy way to learn. Like, I assume that was your sentiment as well, because we've echoed this multiple times. But the whole point of learning is to be able to retain what's taught to you. But in school, it's you sort of learn this habit of just forgetting it once it's no longer relevant for your current unit or applicable. And it's just quite harmful when you're trying to do anything in practice. Like, I could give an example of driving. It's like, well, if I learned how to use the gas and the brake in an effective way, and then I need to learn steering techniques, but I forgot all of my gas and brake techniques, then I'm gonna fly into a wall. Like, it's an unhealthy way to try and learn new concepts which are taught to you.
I don't know, worse than that to me, I would say it's just an ineffective way to learn. Like, I think that there is no way that you can do that or learn in that way and still be able to apply it effectively in the world. It's just not the kind of methodology that's going to be beneficial in the long term. It's okay as a short-term strategy, but if you're not actively using the knowledge that you're gaining, you're going to lose it.
Yeah, this is something that I've seen in a couple of videos across the internet, which is like, use the knowledge that you gain and you won't forget it. And another thing that I've seen is, like, give it some sort of value and you won't forget it. And I think those are incredibly important long-term techniques, because, I mean, like you said, it's fine in the short term, but if you're trying to really, like, learn a skill that you want it to be lifelong, you need to have a not only a sustainable way to do it, but a sustainable way to practice it. It's, your brain is almost like a muscle. Like, if you're not going to use it and exercise it, then it's just going to sort of become withered and tired, and it's not really going to function in the way that you need it to function. So knowledge works just the same. If you're not exercising the knowledge, then it sort of starts to fade away, like muscle memory. It doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, I think that we've been talking about this in general pretty well. I think we understand kind of the problem here, but let me talk a little bit about sort of the specifics here for me. Where, for example, I didn't understand how exactly my brain was processing information, and so what I did was research a little bit of neuroscience to actually get a better sense of what are effective ways to keep, like, to retain knowledge long term, or and just better ways to conceptualize things so that I could make connections more efficiently. And stuff that I was finding had to do not really with just seeing, like, having the information present and summarizing it, which feels to me like kind of the technique in school, where it's sort of like, here's this brain dump of information, take some very high level notes on the concepts you're getting, and, like, try to recall those things again down the line. The value of, or the techniques that I'm talking about, always seem to require you to go above and beyond that, where you were forced to engage with the material at a deeper level. So, for example, tools of encoding, where you're having to take the information and translate it into a form that more naturally fits in your brain. For example, it's very easy to remember song lyrics or films where there's a lot of, like, very clear story going on, and you can remember, like, this happens, which causes this to happen, and so on and so forth. So if you can start to your knowledge in the form of more interesting or exciting events, if you can tell yourself a story, it makes it a lot easier to remember things.
This is sort of what I was trying to harp on when I was talking about giving it a value. That practice of trying to synthesize the information into something that makes more sense in your brain is, to me, sort of what I think about when I'm thinking about giving it a value. Like if I'm trying to remember something about, let's just say someone's name. I'm at a party. I got to remember someone's name. I'm more likely to just try and remember someone's name if it fits somewhere into a puzzle, or if there's a consequence if I forget it, or something of that sort. I seem to have a slightly better retention for it. I mean, moreover, that sort of idea of synthesis is like, right, if school gives you a dump of information, then there's no way that you are going to remember the 30-minute lecture that your teacher gives you.
To your
But a lot of people will sort of, oh, no, go ahead.
to your point about that, I think, for example, the idea of like trying to remember someone's name at a party is great. One of the techniques that fits exactly the kind of encoding that I'm talking about here is, so if I met you and you say, "Hey, my name is Jack," what I might do is I might picture a car jack, you standing on top of it, and me like lifting you up or something. You know what I mean? And that image
Oh, yeah.
is going to allow me to, because it's like something weird and out there and just like kind of bizarre, it's going to stick in my brain better. So when I want to try to recall your name, I don't try to think of what's his name. I try to like picture the image that I had conjured up for myself, and I go, oh, his name is Jack, right?
Yeah, whatever, some wonky or funky thing which prompts your brain to remembering the thing is definitely important. I've done it with so many things. Like, especially one of the things that I use this quite often for is trying to remember what different cars look like, because I could pick out a car by its tail lights. And to me, the easiest way to do it is like try and remember some smaller minute detail that's really funky about the way that it works. And that's how I remember it. It's like, people are like, well, how do you know the difference between a 488 and a 488 Pista? Just a special version of one car. It's like, well, it's got a hole in its nose. The rest of the car might as well look identical. If you saw it from a distance and you were an untrained eye, you probably couldn't tell a difference between the two cars. But it's very easy to tell once you're looking for the hole in the nose. It's quite easy to retain.
So another technique that comes to mind, which was I think illuminating to me, but turns out not to be all that useful unless you have like very specific kind of lists of things that you need to remember. Like there are certainly use cases for this, but called the method of loci, or memory palaces. I've probably talked to you a little bit about this, but this the part of it that I find interesting was the fact that your brain is extremely good at spatial memory, but it's very bad at other things. And so what you can start to do is you can actually map knowledge onto spatial journeys in order to recall them. So in order to remember something, you just think about a path in space that you might know very well. So it could be like you walking around from the kitchen in your house to your bedroom. Or if you walk to school every day, it might be like you just follow along that path in your mind. And because your brain is so good at spatial information, it doesn't even have to try to remember it. You can actually inject sort of encoded knowledge into that journey, and it allows you to recall it. This sort of gave me a sense of how powerful the brain can be when you leverage the things that it's good at.
This is interesting because when I drive to school every day, I sort of like began to notice that, like, I'll get into my car, turn it on, and then I'll just realize that I'm like halfway there as I'm driving. And it's like totally random. I'm like, wait, what happened to the first like 5 minutes of this drive in my memory? I don't even know what happened. I know that you and me have also talked about sort of the power of being able to offload conscious processes to your subconscious. Does this somehow tie into what you sort of were thinking here?
Not really, but I think where you were going with some of that is that you have learned the route so well that you can almost do it without thinking. And that is sort of similar. But for example, like you've probably gone to a friend's house, and maybe a friend's house you've been to only once. But if I asked you to recall how to get to the bathroom in their house, you could probably tell me.
Oh, 100%. It's one of my greatest skills is remembering where every single person's house is.
Well, that it's what I'm trying to say is that that's not specific to you. Like once you go into a house and like learn the layout once, even weeks later, you can recall that layout with ease. And because this is how our brains evolved over the millennia, is like to literally be able to very quickly reason about space. It's very important to be able to know how to get from shelter to find food and get back home, find water, get back home. You know what I mean? Like this is sort of the key need of human.
This is true, but I'll make the side argument that as like modern technology and like navigation has advanced, it's interesting to see how those processes start to fade, like in sort of the conscience of society. Like as certain skills become less and less important, people start to just not use them. And I guess this is almost sort of to your point. If you're not using the skills, then they sort of just become, it's like you never learned them in the first place. Like I know that a lot of my friends, when they first started to learn how to drive, are constantly using navigation to get to places which they've gone to multiple times, and I'm just like, well, okay, I get it, but like you've gone here before, and like I'll remember where to go. But then again, I was always using the skill when with dad driving around, like mapping out the city in my head, but most people just weren't even thinking about that, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to disagree here. Like I what I'm talking about is stuff that's so deeply ingrained in how our brains operate that it's not really a skill where if you don't use it it's going to go away. Like your brain is extraordinarily good at spatial processing, and that like there's not really a situation where if you don't do it you're going to lose it. Like yes, there are people who are bad at directions, like I agree, but at the same time, again, if you put someone in a house they've never been in for the first time, they walk around it once, you bring them back again in 2 months, they're probably still going to be able to find the bathroom.
Yeah, no, that's totally fair. I would agree with that.
So the point that I was trying to get at with this is that while it may not always be useful to just try to put a bunch of knowledge in a list and try to recall it in order, there actually is value to being able to learn and map that to kind of spatial locations. Like there is still value in being able to associate knowledge with or to utilize your spatial processing to retain knowledge better. So while this specific technique isn't always valuable, learning how to sort of say, okay, I'm going to put myself in a specific location and learn something, you might be able to then associate that the context of that location with the knowledge that you're learning, and therefore be able to recall it better in the future. So what I'm really getting at is that these are techniques that help you, because again, we're talking about learning how to learn. And what I'm getting at is that a big part of that for me was starting to understand literally how your brain developed so that you can leverage the things that the brain is naturally good at without trying to force yourself to do things that are sort of the requirements of the new world where there's a lot of information you need to learn, and you're just trying to apply rote memorization. That's all not going to be effective, because in the history of humanity we haven't ever needed to do that up until the last like 100 years or so. You know what I mean?
This is actually an interesting point because I've started doing this myself, and I can't remember where I saw it, but someone was just like, try not working in your bed. Like, try setting it, like having a designated workspace. Because I would very much so just like bring my computer around when I was doing studying for school or trying to, even do work for the podcast, and I would just lay on my bed and do it. And it sort of turned my bed in my brain into a sort of like space for work and not so much a place for sleep. So I would like lay in my bed and feel like I needed to be getting work done. And it was interesting to notice how those ties sort of started to form in my brain. And the second I sort of started to just like either just sit on the couch at the coffee table or at the dinner table or use my setup here to do work, it started to feel a lot more deliberate and intentional with what I was doing. Like I was like, okay, I'm going to sit down at my desk and do work for the podcast, and I'm going to sit at the table when I'm doing work for school, and I'm not going to do that when I'm in my bed. I'm just going to relax there. So sort of quartering off those spaces was something that I actually did find quite effective for helping me learn.
Yeah, and that definitely speaks to the fact that you're, I mean, part of that is going to be spatial processing, but more of that is actually just the fact that you are specifically associating specific spaces with different activities. So like you're creating connections there that you're able to leverage in the future. Like this is definitely part of the same family of techniques for sure. I think that there's a lot of stuff that you can learn from little things like that that might not appear to make a big difference, but that actually have can have a lot of leverage if you try to do them. So picking different spaces to work on different things, dedicating specific spaces for that definitely makes it easier for your brain to sort of get back into that space or that mindset when you come back into that space. But there's so many techniques here that what I'm trying to get at is none of this stuff was ever even brought up in school, where it's like, how does the brain learn? How does it process information? And just asking those questions, examining those things sort of helped me grasp the value of attempting techniques beyond just rote memorization and note taking. Like the reason that we take notes in school is because there was no way to have that information available after the lecturer had finished what they were saying. It was like the value of notes is that you have a record of what was said. And today you can simply record the audio, or most of the time you're watching a lecture online, you can just rewind and replay it. Like there's that the need to do that kind of note taking doesn't really exist anymore unless it's kind of artificially imposed on you through the way that school still operates. So what I'm talking about is really just thinking about techniques that might be more able to leverage what your brain is naturally good at. That's really the crux of this whole thing.
This is a good point because your brain is certainly good at certain things and horrible at others. And I even think that certain people's brains, of course, will be better at certain things than others. People might have a crap long-term memory and a really good short-term memory or vice versa. And again, there's that personalization aspect which is going to come back into it of, being able to know yourself and knowing the techniques which work best for you versus what might work best for someone else, and sort of creating your own synthesized way that helps you learn the best is really all about knowing what you're good at and emphasizing your learning process around what you are really good at.
And there's something to be said for that for sure, which is, certain techniques are going to work better for certain people. I mean, obviously, some of these are based on evolutionary principles where it's like, these are probably going to be effective if you apply them, but people are going to have their own routines that are going to be beneficial to them. So I think that the process of learning how to learn is definitely a process of self exploration, in the sense that you need to figure out when you are learning something, what allows you to be able to recall that information effectively. If you want to learn something and then be able to remember it months from now after having not thought about it, there's a good chance that if you don't use some sort of learning technique, that knowledge is just going to fade away. So if you can find a way to make that knowledge stick out in your brain, you will have learned more effectively. And that's, I guess, when I'm thinking about learning something, it has a lot to do with how well I'm able to use it, apply it in the world when it matters to me, in the context that it matters to me.
Yeah, I think that's a really good sentiment because my life centers around cars, as you know, and most people know about me. It runs like literally through my veins. Like it probably smells like gasoline in there, but I am able to so easily recall such information and facts and whatever about it because I was so effectively able to structure it to use in my life. It was never sort of a like external part of who I was. It sort of just like became molded into my identity as a little kid and started to become a natural part of like the way that I literally live my life. Certainly there were techniques and strategies and sort of just like raw repetition that put it into my head, but a lot of it came from that innately to me cars were cool, so they had value, so they stuck out in my head. So, I mean, like you said, being able to have information stick out in your head and in your processes is important. But what I really liked about that is the fact that, you know, just having the ability to make it feel like it's easy to use and operate on in your life is incredibly important in thinking about good ways to learn.
Yeah, I think that when you engage with the material, like you're saying, for you, learning about cars is interesting. So you're engaging with it at a different level where you're not just taking in the information once and doing nothing with it. You're actively engaging in trying to understand how it relates to other pieces of information and why it's important. And you're doing what I'm saying, which is going that extra level deeper into synthesizing that information into valuable knowledge, where it matters not just that you've heard or understood a concept. Like understanding and learning are not the same thing. I can understand something and then very quickly forget it. If I want to learn it, I have to integrate it into my knowledge.
Yeah, that's really, that right there hit probably the nail on the head for me. It's just like, if you if you really want something to like stick with you really well, then it's that idea of learning and not understanding. It's like, in my head I've always thought about it as like understanding and internalization, but it's become such like just a usable and like just fundamental way to go about taking in new information about, I mean, just cars or anything in general, that these techniques are like incredibly personal. Like you said, it's an entirely personal journey, but that big tool of it being something which you can constantly use and go back to, and it doesn't feel like something that you have to sort of go and reach for, has got to be the biggest piece.
Yeah, I just want people to think more about taking responsibility for their own learning because it's so important at this stage in society that we are flexible in what we can learn. We need to be learners for our entire lives at this point. And being able to do that effectively is sort of the skill that's going to give you the most leverage. And that's, for me, I've found adaptability to be the skill that has enabled me to get where I am. And learning how I learned, taking the time to figure out what worked for me, what makes things stick in my mind, how I'm able to effectively engage with material. This is what enabled me to learn more efficiently and retain that knowledge where I need it. So I think that while we haven't gotten into so much of the detail of all these techniques, the key takeaway is really that you can learn how you learn. There is science behind this, and there are practical tools that you can apply to learn more effectively. You don't have to be stuck in the mindset that the only way to learn is to be lectured at and to take surface level notes.
I would say that the techniques aren't the most important part here, because I think those are all personal and you can't call any of them really universal. But the concepts which those techniques function upon and operate around are definitely the important things. And I think we've done a good job of highlighting some of those in this episode for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I would challenge that a little bit. I'm not. I do think that there are definitely universal techniques like building concept graphs that will work for everyone if you kind of know what you're doing. Again, like mnemonics work really well for people. Like, there's a lot of stuff that does work, and yes, you need to choose the ones that are going to be most helpful for you. But it's not a question of are these going to be effective for you. It's like what feels best to you. Like there are definitely what I would consider universal techniques. I think we can probably do a deeper dive on this maybe one day if we uh, are more interested. But overall, yeah, I think the important aspect to take away from this is just that it is an important skill to be able to, like, learning itself is a skill. It is an acquirable skill, and I think that that's where most people miss the mark, is that they don't think that learning is a skill and they never try to get better at it. When I realized that learning isn't what happens when you go to school and someone like teaches you, like learning is something that you can actively get better at, like that's when things change for me.
That's actually quite interesting. That sort of shift in paradigm in the way you thought about learning is when that started to change. And that's interesting because I feel like it's sort of never really had to shift that greatly in my head. I definitely remember that there was a time when I started to hear about it and it started to become more conscious, but it felt like I learned about it early enough on in my journey of learning that I never really had so much of this like, great shift. I had sort of like caught it early enough to still have the nuance to like learn in this sort of way and think about learning as something that I had to do myself, because I was like, maybe probably, I don't know, maybe sixth or seventh grade when you started talking to me about this. So I've been able to think about the ways that I've been learning for a long time and develop these methods to work best for myself. So I think that's actually kind of an interesting sort of thing to talk about there.
Yeah, well, it's something that most people actually never really take in, that never really sinks in for them, because the only kind of learning they've ever done is when someone is teaching them. And thinking about doing it proactively is definitely a big mental shift. And just realizing that you can get better at it if you if you want to take the time to actually learn about what constitutes learning, how can you get better at it, and how do you practice it. Like, this stuff exists, and you should know that it exists, and you should try to acquire that skill, because it will be the most beneficial thing in a world that is rapidly changing.
I think that's great. I know we don't really have enough time to get too much deeper into this, but I think we should 100% revisit this with a little more depth at a later date.
Sounds great.
Well, if you guys enjoyed this episode, you can find more content just like this at The Wrong Idea on Instagram, TikTok, and X. And until then, keep being wrong.
Got a thought that challenges the norm? We want to hear it. Post your wrong idea with the hashtag #WrongIdea. That's RONG idea. And join the conversation. Who knows? Your perspective might just be featured in a future episode. Remember, in a world of endless perspectives, all ideas are wrong ideas. Until next time, keep thinking, keep challenging, and keep embracing the unconventional.